Hey everybody, what's up? I am back. I think I've been away for about a week, so I just had other stuff to do. But I am back to talk about the same things. So it does seem like people have kind of a limitless, I don't know, energy, motivation to talk about certain sorts of topics. I've been popping in and listening to other people's lives on here, and it really does look like a lot of people just want to talk about whether God exists or not. And I don't know that I find that to be the most interesting topic. I should say also, you should check out my YouTube channel because and it's Lance Independent. Just go on Google, look up Lance Independent, and you will find I just posted a video where Nathan from Digital Gnosis, Nathan is on YouTube, but is not on TikTok as far as I know. At least I've never seen Nathan over here, and I would have expected to see him if he was here. Anyway, so Nathan and I did a review of Sam Harris's latest video. So to give a little backstory, Sam Harris published a book back in 2011 called The Moral Landscape, where he makes a case for moral realism, some type of naturalist moral realism from the looks of it. And I was very critical of the book when it came out, and I've remained very critical of that book since then. I do have a guest request, so I will return to talking about that if I do get a chance, but for now we will see what my guest has to say.
Hey Lance, how's it
Hey,
going?
how's it going?
Oh, I guess we talked at the same time. Good. How are you?
Good, good, good. What's up?
Hey, so I'm atheist myself, but I grew up Christian, and I've always kind of struggled with the idea of like us not having free will, and I've never really been able to figure out, so basically, I'm just wanting to have a little discussion to understand, I guess, that idea that we don't have free will. Is that something that we could discuss?
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So I guess what is your premise on us not being? Do you feel that there's a difference between free will and the freedom to choose, or are those like the same thing?
I think of them as different things. I certainly think we have certain kinds of freedom, and I certainly think that we can make choices, and I think our choices matter. So I don't think that what it is that I'm denying entails any sort of like nihilism, or that
Okay.
or like the criminal justice system is completely unjustified. I mean, there's certainly problems with any particular instantiation of it, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't punish people or prevent people from doing bad stuff in some ideal, like, in some ideal form at least. So
Okay.
I don't think that my rejection of free will has any significant practical implications. And so what I let me give a little background about what it is I'm denying. So
Okay.
in academic philosophy, they use the term free will in this very esoteric technical context. And I don't want to assume too much, but do you have any familiarity with how like contemporary academic philosophers characterize free will?
A bit. I mean, I took a philosophy class in college. I've studied a bit on Socrates, Aristotle, Plato. But I wouldn't say that I'm a master in it all. I'm kind of delving back into it to learn a bit more. I just started reading the Art of War last night, so just trying to delve into philosophies a bit more. So yeah, I know a bit, I guess, is the answer.
Okay, so that's cool. Here's what I wanted to point out.
Okay.
The way that someone like Greg Caruso, Dirk Pereboom, and others, these are sort of contemporary philosophers working on free will. They define it in a really interesting way. They see it as, and I'll just read off what Caruso
Okay.
says in
Yeah.
Neurolaw.
Great.
Free will he defines as the control and action required for basic desert moral responsibility. So I find that to be a very narrow and specific conception of free will. And basic desert moral responsibility is moral responsibility where we deserve praise and blame solely in virtue of the rightness or wrongness of our actions, and not for any sort of practical benefits that would be obtained through that punishment. So, you might punish a dog or something, like, put it in timeout or take its toy away. in order to teach it, hey, like you can't bite people or whatever. And in that case, you hopefully are not holding the dog morally responsible for what it did. It's just that certain types of rewards and punishments can be used to encourage and discourage behavior, and is intended to achieve a practical outcome. Now, that is not the type of punishment, praise, blame that they're talking about. They're talking about like if someone unalives somebody intentionally to like get their insurance money or something, that it's not that you would punish that person to deter other people from committing crime or whatever. It's that you'd punish them because they deserve punishment. They deserve it, independent of whatever benefits would come from it. That's basic desert. It's like, it's not consequentialist or utilitarian or practical. And what they construe free will as is whatever type of control we have over our actions that would make a person an appropriate subject of that type of responsibility. And the issue is that I just don't believe that there is that type of responsibility. And so there is no type of control over action we could have that would give us that type of responsibility, because there's no conditions under which we would have that kind of responsibility. So I'm denying something very specific in the academic literature. And so you might say, okay, well, you know what, I'll pause there, but there's more to say about that.
Okay. I guess because of my, continued deconstruction of religion, the idea of free will to me is, of course, probably still rooted in the Christian upbringing that I had, and that I think of myself, being able to choose and act freely upon, whatever things I'm interacting with in my day-to-day life. And so I guess to me, the idea that there is not free will is saying that, and I guess you kind of said at the beginning that it's not like a nihilistic viewpoint and that like we're programmed to do things, right? You're not saying that, but just that there's no, I don't know,
I could give a really concise summary of what I'm saying. I think that the notion of free will that many people have in mind in philosophy, and I think in some sort of, I guess you could say, watered down form, is a concept that has origins in monotheistic religions and was devised as a means of holding people accountable and calling them sinners for their actions. I think it's a quasi-theological notion, and that when we discard that particular notion, this metaphysically laden notion of free will, what we're not left with is no ability to structure our societies in practically useful ways. We're not left with a sense that people don't cause their own actions. We're not left with a sense that people don't have control over what they do. We can have all of that. What I want people to do is distance themselves from the theistic and philosophical baggage that's been appended to this particular word. So if you drop the word free will and just say, what is it that you think is true about people? Then I think you and I, there's a good chance we would agree. And if you define free will in a very, I guess you could say, prosaic or mundane way, I'd be perfectly happy to say we have that kind of free will.
Okay. All right. Well, that's fair. I appreciate you chatting with me about it for a minute. That gives me some things to think about. So, yeah, thank you.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So I will move on to the next guest in a moment.
Yeah,
Thanks
go ahead.
for
I'll jump
coming.
off.
Yep. So one thing I would say is about this particular issue is that terms like free will, here's what I will say about a term like free will. The term itself is so poorly specified, ill-defined, and unclear that much of the dispute in philosophy is about what the term is. So you have these compatible, I should say what the term means. So you have these libertarian conceptions of free will and compatibilist conceptions of free will, and then within those are subcategories and subcategories and subcategories. And there's something really strange about it, as if they're all offering an account of the same thing, when one could rather reconstrue them as effectively different accounts of different things, and then they're all vying for this label, free will. Well, one of these accounts could be true and the other could be true, and they're just both about different things, and then we just call them both free will. I commonly use this example. The word bank. The word bank can refer to a financial institution. It could also refer to a river bank. And, languages polysemous like this are, I've taken to saying polysemous. I used to say polysemous. I don't even know which one is correct, or if there is a correct one. That's another funny thing about language. Often there's multiple pronunciations. So I like to say interesting. but most people I think now say interesting. Anyway, that's a tangent. It's a tangent within a tangent. I do those a lot. Uh, so, so on the bank note, really all language is to a certain extent polysemous, and it could have very clear and distinct divisions in some cases, like riverbank, financial bank, but also words shade into shade in their meaning from one context to another. So it's not like you have like if you had a Venn diagram of usages of a word, riverbank and financial bank would be like two non-overlapping circles, like all the banks that you go to for money and all the banks that are riverbanks and you go fishing there or swimming or whatever, those don't overlap. But then there's other uses of terminology where they semi-overlap, and it could be that they overlap right at the edges, or they could be that they're almost used in exactly the same way. And that's really how words work, that whenever you use a word, its meaning isn't necessarily identical to your usage of that term in previous contexts, nor will it be in future contexts, nor are other people's usages of the terms intended to communicate exactly the same idea. It's really that there's a sort of statistical averaging over our usage of any particular term in any particular context that mostly overlaps, and that's how we're largely able to communicate. It's not like all these words are rigidly specified in their meaning, and I think people just don't appreciate that words don't really ever have any meaning outside of any particular context of usage. They entirely derive their meaning from the communicative context in which the terms are employed, and that all language is sloppy and messy and totally chaotic. Now, that makes a lot of traditional philosophy really hard. What it also indicates is that this notion of free will, we need to be very careful about language. And if we're not careful about language, we're going to make a whole bunch of philosophical mistakes. This is not an original point with me. This is an insight that Wittgenstein had and that other philosophers have had, that many issues in philosophy that seem deep and meaningful and practically significant are nothing of the sort. They are conceptual confusions and people tripping up over their language. Okay, let me bring up the next guest. Hey, how's it going?
Oh, hello. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. I so for your first claim, I think I'm actually pretty sympathetic to your views already. So I'm not so much to discuss that. The second claim is interesting. That you don't for the free will claim. Well, I know you were talking about earlier how there's different semantic usages of free will. When you say there's no free will, what do you mean by that?
What I mean is that people don't have any sort of basic desert responsibility. That's one thing I mean. I mean that people don't have any sort of special causal powers. So I'm going to reject any type of
Yeah,
agent causation conception of free will. Sorry?
I know. I'm saying you probably reject agent causation. Then. Okay.
Right. And I also, I don't know if I'd say I reject compatibilist conceptions of free will. I just don't like calling them those conceptions of free will. So if somebody says, hey, we can devise a socially constructed system in which we hold one another mutually accountable for certain types of, for people that perform certain actions, conditional on them having certain types of volition, fine. That's fine with me. So, if you have some view like Dan Dennett or somebody else, a compatibilist view where you hold people accountable when they're responsive to reasons in a certain way, I'm fine with doing that as a matter of practicality, but I don't know why we would call that free will. I think the term free will has too much historical baggage to keep using the term.
Yeah, okay, I think that's understandable. Like if you look at Frankfurt cases, there's a question of whether or not even Frankfurt cases are supposed to show that you're acting freely or just you have more responsibility. And it's not really clear, depending on who you ask and their interpretation of Frankfurt, it's not really clear. Because you're right, you could have people like John Morton Fisher, who are semi-compatibilists, who don't think you're acting freely, but you have more responsibility. So it is a little tricky. But your claim then also reaches to moral responsibility points, which I find odd. Because even if you didn't want to say there's free will, why would you want to then exclude moral responsibility?
So it's going to depend exactly on what someone means by moral responsibility. So I am totally fine with holding people morally responsible with, relative to my own philosophical views and framework and perspective. I'm a moral anti-realist. I'm a pragmatist. And so I think that our moral systems are socially constructed systems for which there is no stance independent fact of the matter about which actions are right or wrong, or what conditions under which it's correct or incorrect or justified or warranted or whatever to hold anybody responsible. And so moral responsibility for me is something to be decided upon or socially navigated as a matter of negotiation within a particular social context and sort of normative institutions. It could change. It could change the next day if you have a further discussion. So I don't think there's any sort of objective fact of the matter about when a person performs any particular action, given their state of mind at the time that they perform the action, of whether or not they are or are not morally responsible in some way that's true independent of some relativized standard of evaluation.
Yeah, I think that's fine. Even for like anti-realist conceptions, I would think of if you want to hold blameworthiness in a way that isn't objective. Like there are these, I don't have to posit that there are these objective, stance-independent external reasons that are holding people accountable, to which if they violate, they're somehow blameworthy. But would you extend it also to like just like I could seem to say like, look, this person thinks, this person is blameworthy for an action, and I think that's unreasonable that they're holding them accountable for that action, or cases of and vice versa where I think, hey, look, this person seems blameworthy, it's reasonable to hold this person in a way that's blameworthy. Do you have those kind of intuitions about those things?
I'm uncomfortable calling them.
Sense.
Yeah, I'm uncomfortable calling them intuitions. I mean, that term is I think so used and abused in philosophy in such a variety of ways.
I can say what I mean. Like, when I use intuition, I'm just thinking of like a type of intellectual seeming or something like that.
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing I have an issue with. So I'm pretty sympathetic to some of what Timothy Williamson has said about intuitions, that he regards intuitions largely as continuous with ordinary judgment, and there's nothing fundamentally special or sui generis or unique about them.
Okay.
And so if we're talking about like, do I have an inclination to render a judgment in that way? Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So when you say there's no moral responsibility, then you're just meaning it in an objective sense.
Roughly, yeah. It doesn't require moral realism. It could be that a person has some other sort of conditions that they have in mind, some descriptive set of facts for when a person is or isn't morally responsible, without presupposing that the moral responsibility that they're talking about itself turns on some type of realism. They could be some type of constructivist, for instance, and I'd probably still reject that too. I don't know. That might not be super clear though.
Yeah. Even from like the standpoint of that's an interesting way to phrase it, because I can't now phrase it, I can't phrase the question as if you think people are blameworthy, because the question was, well, exactly by which standard are we talking about? Are they blameworthy? I could obviously say they're blameworthy according to Joe's opinion, but that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, and I certainly would say that. So a lot of times philosophers will frame things in terms of like what you can and can't say, and I would certainly say people are blameworthy, especially in an everyday context. Like I would say, if a person unalived a bunch of people to turn them into lampshades or something, I'm going to say that person's very much blameworthy.
And there are cases where you would probably say, if this person was under mind control by someone else, that they wouldn't be blameworthy.
Yeah, I would say that too. So a lot of what I would say would end up paralleling what a lot of people would say about free will. So basically, I think you can have all these deflated and anti-realist analogs to what philosophers are talking about. I think philosophers are just overwrought in their metaphysics. And I think when you pare it back, you could still more or less speak in the same way as they do without much, and act in the same way and achieve pretty much the same practical outcomes without much loss. I just think a lot of the metaphysics that they talk about is superfluous.
Okay, that's fine, because I'm thinking even under, like, I'm sympathetic to anti-realist systems, and I'm fine saying, cheating is bad or cheating is wrong. But I don't mean it in a stance of I'm just meaning it in regards to maybe like some type of internal reason account, or And I think the same thing could probably work for blameworthiness. When I say someone's blameworthy, it's in reference to internal reasons. I have those kind of conceptions I think we probably agree that there's just the metaphysical baggage that's different.
And if you look at how free will is discussed in the contemporary analytic literature, it's very much tied to the notion of basic desert. And I not only don't think that there is any such thing as basic desert, I don't really have basic desert intuitions. Like, for instance, I don't have retributive intuitions. I don't think if someone does something wrong that they deserve punishment to no end, like non-instrumentally. They just ought to be punished.
Okay, I think I agree with you as well. Yeah, I find those very odd. Tributes. I find those intuitions quite weird. Though I am interested, so you also mentioned you did have a view that you were against agent accounts of causation. Are you trying to say that you think events cause things? Or you just what's the
No, no. I recently heard. I was listening to a video where a person's like, "I'm going to ignore event causation and talk about agent causation," and then I just, I that specific account was in my mind, and I'm like, I don't buy this at all. But I'm not going to accept any libertarian conception of free will. A lot of them, I honestly, I don't understand what they're saying.
I should preface. You don't have to be a libertarian when you hold to agent. There are determinists who are agent causalists. It's just a matter of you think substances cause things as opposed to events causing things. And
Yeah, I find all of that discourse to be very strange. I don't know that I hold a position in either respect, and I worry that their notions of events, agents, and causality are all notions that I would think are conceptually confused or unintelligible or false.
yeah, I don't have an opinion on the matter. I think that any kind of view that would boil down to causation. Well, I guess you could hold different views for what causation is, ignoring the whole libertarian stuff. Just what we think of causation, we may think of different things as having being causes. We may think of events as being causes and events having causal powers to them. We may think of substances being causes and substances having causal powers to them. At the end of the day, whatever you conceive of, I don't think I have intuitions either way, and I also think at the end of the day, it's just going to bottleneck out to something primitive about what causation is. Uh, I don't think it
Yeah,
gets
it might, but
into.
I have an allergy to primitive concepts and an allergy to metaphysics, and so when people start talking about primitive concepts in metaphysics, I'm just like, oh.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah,
I want to jettison as much metaphysics as we possibly can. And so in a lot of these cases it's like, well, is this conception or that conception correct? And I want to discard the whole framework.
yeah, that's interesting. Because a lot of the time, like take compatibilist notions. If you hold this like Humean view about causation, like some like David Lewis like view, then you could be a compatibilist in certain respects. It's very easy for someone to be a compatibilist just because they don't think that the laws of nature are these actual like ontological
Yeah.
forces that are guiding things. But inversely, you could also hold that the laws of nature are these ontological forces guiding things. And I don't. It seems weird. That I feel like I instead of disregarding the debate, I could just be like, look, I just want to disregard this concept because it makes my metaphysics so much more complicated or unnecessary, and hold to a much more simpler model. But at the end of the day, I'm still having a metaphysical system or model. I'm not sure. Are you trying to disregard the views themselves and answering the questions? Are you trying to disregard the questions? I'm curious how you would approach the problem.
Not so what you propose sounds plausible to me. Like, okay, if I was going to operate within the sort of analytic paradigm, then that's probably the best compromise I could come up with. But I am largely opposed to the entire framework in which a lot of these issues are articulated in the first place. So, the sort of two guiding forces behind my philosophical framework is pragmatism and quietism. And the quietism is largely a sort of product of the pragmatism, and the pragmatism is a product of a sort of, and this is where it's hard to say here's where my justification is. So someone could say, so you're starting with your assumptions, I guess. So I'm just an empiricist at heart, just straight up, just empiricist all the way. That doesn't mean that I don't think that you can have your quasi a prioristic judgments about things and mathematics and other sorts of stuff. But for me, they're all sort of subsumed within the sort of pragmatic fold. And so I take a view very much like like William James takes at the beginning of his lectures, where he's like, give us facts and give us lots of, what does he say, principles, where he's not at all in advocating pragmatism, attempting to expunge a priorism and rationalism so much as effectively subsume it within that fold and say, look, we can, the rationalists and empiricists, we can all get along, but really in a way where I think the rationalism is absorbed into empiricism. And within that approach, I think that so much of the metaphysics that has come to dominate 20th century analytic philosophy is just so overwrought and misguided. And I think a lot of it is, I'm going to be very much in the Wittgenstein camp and thinking that a lot of this is rooted in linguistic and conceptual issues. But I also think that there's a protracted legacy of influences that would be totally unsurprising, which is Plato, Aristotle, and Christianity. And I think that they have had centuries to congeal and accrue in people's minds to where people I think when they study analytic philosophy, especially when they are native English speakers that are exposed mostly to the Western philosophy, if they're raised Christian, there's all these factors that are going to correlate and I think are causally intertwined with this. I think it bakes into people not just a disposition towards holding what I take to be overwrought and unjustified metaphysical views, but I think it sort of permeates their whole methodology. So philosophers I think, are just so caught up in thinking that they have some kind of special access to fundamental facts about the nature of reality via access to their phenomenology or their language. And I think that whole project is totally misguided, and I want to step out of the whole thing.
Yeah, that's interesting then. So I guess for you, you're not trying to ignore the questions. You're just, I guess, disagreeing with the certain methodological tools that philosophers pose and try to use to figure out some of these problems. You mentioned before you don't have certain intuitions towards these things. But I know you. I mean, you don't have more realist intuitions. I think you mentioned previously before you don't have intuitions about what it's likeness, like those kind of phenomenal intuitions. You think if you had those intuitions, would your views change at all?
I don't know. I probably. I am not entirely sure. So, like, I don't even think intuitions are like a special kind of thing. I think that this tendency for philosophers to talk about intuitions, there's something suspicious about it. I don't know that, clearly people are having some type of psychological states, but I don't know that they're all of a kind. And if you look at the literature on intuitions, it's not entirely clear that philosophers have ever been consistent about what they mean. So sometimes intuitions are sort of one's initial pre-theoretical judgments about issues or an attempt to be one. Sometimes they're post-theoretical and they're the result of reflection. Sometimes they are dispositions to render a judgment whether or not one has it. Sometimes they're a type of they're more phenomenologically basic than that, and they seem to be closer to something like acquaintance. And so intuitions are all over the map in terms of their apparent phenomenology and relation to other mental states. There's just something funny about people talking about intuition.
I see what you're saying. In the case of when the intuition is taken to be, it seems weird to say a certain disposition towards something. I mean, I still know some philosophers would define it as such. A certain intellectual, like a certain disposition towards a certain judgment.
Yeah, I could say, so the reason why they do that is because you will get stuff like this. You could get an error theorist that says, look, I have realist intuitions, I just think they're mistaken because of evolutionary debunking arguments or something like that. And so they might say I have a disposition to endorse realism, but it's defeasible.
Yeah, you have defeater. You could say the same thing, though, right, for regular intuitions about things. There's a certain seeming, and I could talk about that seeming in a way that's a sui generis way.
Right.
Look, yeah. I have certain defeaters for this, though, right? Like, I have the seeming that, like, the table in front of me is solid, but really the particles are spaced out in such where most of it's empty space, this table, right?
Yeah, and I'm not going to be so stubborn that I wouldn't acknowledge that I have the intuition that the table, I'm touching a table right now, is solid. It certainly seems solid to me.
Yeah.
And it's defeasible, so it's not solid. There's lots of empty space there. So, if I'm like, I don't want to say this or I don't want to hold that view, I won't do that for literally everything, but I will do it for specific things, and qualia is definitely one of them. But, I'll give you an example. This is one of the things that actually set me on the path of studying philosophy, although I guess I was already on that path because I was in a philosophy class. But I was in an ethics class. It was Intro to Ethics. And this was the first time maybe I'd seen it before, but this was the first time we really dug into the trolley problem. I think we were actually reading, I don't know if we were reading the original Philippa Foot stuff or what, but I encountered the trolley problem, and we encountered the switch and the footbridge case in rapid succession. And I remember not having some kind of like, it's okay to pull the switch, but it's wrong to push in the footbridge. I didn't have that reaction, but I also didn't have the reaction, it's okay to push in the footbridge. Rather, I had this reaction of, it feels horrible, like to push a person. That would be awful. I wouldn't want to do that, but it would maximize utility. So like, I didn't have a judgment I didn't have any sort of like oomph pushing me towards it's permissible to push or not permissible to push. I just found myself agnostic on it and noticing my emotional reaction to it. And there was just no accompanying sense that there was a correct answer. And I recall discussing this. I don't remember if I discussed it at the time or later, but like when I reported this sort of non-reaction, I encountered a kind of a incredulity or pushback from others, like, well, no, but you got to pick one. Like everybody has an intuition one way or the other, and I just didn't.
Yeah, that's
Oh,
interesting.
another one, Gettier cases, same reaction. I don't have a feeling like that is or isn't knowledge. I'm like, okay, I don't know what to tell you in that case.
Yeah, no, I'm trying to think. There are certain cases for sure where, so for Gettier cases, I have the intuition. Trolley cases, I have somewhat of an intuition. I think a weaker intuition. But you're right, there are certain cases where I really don't have the intuition whatsoever. I'm so confused. Like, a lot of the time in philosophy of action, there's stuff to do what intentions are. What's an intentional action? And it's always so interesting to like see questions. I'm like, I really don't know what to think about this. Like, if I buy a lottery ticket and I win, do I intentionally win the lottery? Like, I'm supposed to have it. I don't know if I have like a very.
That's a good one. You know what? I don't have an intuition in that case. Did you
there's a lot
intentionally
of
win the lottery?
there's a lot of experimental philosophy that's on this too, and I just see the results, and people have such inconsistent intuitions about these things as well. There's I think a paper by it's either by Nobe or Nadelhoffer, in the 2000s about this. They asked a question of they asked two questions. They say the lottery case, and they say if you have one of those I guess like 6 o'clock live, a weapon that has a 6-barrel chamber, right, and has one bullet.
Careful what you say. We're on TikTok.
Yeah, oops, yeah, I know. I have to be careful. And the trigger goes, and someone passes away as a result of it. And it's a 1/6 chance. Is that person's passing intentional? Do you intentionally make it so that person passes? And like most people think yes to that. They don't think yes to the lottery cases. People's intuitions are all. I've seen experimental philosophy stuff on this. People's intuitions are all over the place in regards to these problems. And I'm like, I don't even think I have strong intuitions about these things. I find these questions so useless to work out what's intuitively the correct definition of an action. What's intuitively the correct definition of intentionally doing something. So I am sympathetic to certain respects. Sometimes I see certain areas of philosophy. I'm like, oh, this is what they're doing. But I think surely in other respects, I would think that there is some benefit with this kind of analysis. It's interesting because if let's take for instance, working out someone's intuitions for like ethics, right? Like population ethics or something. If I have to make a system, I'm trying to figure out, do I donate more money to having malaria nets that are going to save babies in Africa, or saving people who are already adults? I think that there has to be some framework to which I have to work out or consult to be able to get to those kind of the things which I value more, like making an ethical system, or not just even system building per se. There's rather working kind of through those questions and relying on a methodology where I have to use my intuition when making judgments, and that these things have practical considerations to them. It seems to be then I like to think, hey, my intuitions are guiding me to what I think. I trigger to say I should do, because I don't want to say it in an objective sense, but what I want society to be doing. There's a certain aspect in which this is a useful endeavor to be able to go through, like in things like ethics and whatnot. I'm not sure if you think that using intuitions in those respects produce certain useful aims.
Well, I certainly think that we could think about, reflect, render judgment, look for inconsistencies. I have this wariness of the term intuition in these cases, but if we drop the terminology, I certainly think there's lots of work to do where I'll put it this way. I think there's lots of armchair reasoning that could be perfectly productive. I don't think everything has to come down to inferential statistics. And what I would favor doing looks very much like a lot of contemporary philosophy in certain respects. Probably not in others. Like, I think trying to figure out what some terms mean from the armchair is probably a big waste of time. Mm-hmm. So I think the Gettier literature was very misguided.
Yeah, I think that's, if it's literally just semantic disputes. Yeah. If it's cases of actual, more metaphysically substantive things, right, where the only kind of evidence we can rely on is evidence given our intuitions. If I want to think, things like, is presentism versus eternalism or some other type of debate where, there's an actual substantive, thing that's here, whether or not you think the future is legitimate, there actually is a future, or the only thing that exists is the present. And the only way to evaluate this, this obviously is contentious, but in cases where the only way to evaluate these things is going to be through these philosophical methods, and something that we can't rely on empirical sciences for. Do you think the best approach is to remain agnostic toward these particular problems?
Yeah, in some cases I might. So I would ask a question like this: what are we doing with the distinctions? What, like, so if you take competing positions in some metaphysical domain, I would want to start with a sort of pragmatic test, which is, suppose this one was true, suppose that one was true. What practical differences would it make for this to be true rather than that? Would we predict anything different? Would we expect anything different? Would it make a difference in how we judge or deliberate or what we do? So for me, practical considerations have primacy in all of these cases. And that doesn't mean that I don't care about which view is true or not, or that I don't think that there's a potential answer to the question of what's true. So pragmatists are not going to say that there's no truth or there's no fact of the matter about these sorts of things. They're going to take a pragmatic view of what truth itself is. And truth is going to be the consequence of an inquiry, not a sort of target of inquiry. It's something that is constructed, developed, dynamic, and subject to revision through the ongoing process of inquiry. And in cases where the metaphysical distinctions, like there's this or that competing position, would not make any practical difference one way or the other, the world looks the same, I set them aside. I don't know if I would say I'm agnostic on them, like I'm not sure which one is correct or not. In some cases I might, it's really going to be case by case, and I would address it piecemeal. In many cases I would just think there's no fact of the matter. That distinction is conceptually confused or irrelevant, but it's really going to depend on the particular case. In other cases, I might say this position is true and not that one, and that would be the product of some type of inquiry. So for me, though, in all of those cases, one of the first questions is just going to be, what difference would it make? And I think that kind of question is one that a lot of philosophers might be uncomfortable with, because I think they want to get their truth first and then figure out if it's useful or not. And for me, the two are inseparable.
Do you think this also applies into other areas outside of philosophy? Like there's certain inquiries in like cosmology or STEM or other fields where the information doesn't serve any type of instrumental purposes.
Yeah, I think the same thing about the sciences more broadly.
Okay, so that's
and about everyday life. I think this applies to everyday life.
Interesting. Okay. You think that are the kind of tools that analytic philosophers use, though, are actually useful at getting? So even if maybe it's something that isn't pragmatically beneficial, is it useful at trying to get to what truth is in any sense?
What specifically? Maybe I zoned out and didn't catch what you said.
No worries. Like cases of metaphysics. So let's say certain metaphysical questions. You think analytic philosophers are equipped with the right tools and being able to figure out certain metaphysical issues?
Generally, no. I don't think that they are.
Yeah, because cases where there's not semantic dispute. Like for instance, I don't think whether abstract objects exist or something like that isn't up for semantic dispute. They're making the people who think they exist are making a claim about what universals are, or etc. Right? Or again, cases of time where you think the future actually exists, the past actually exists, or because you could give a number of cases where there's something that's being posited, right? Do you think the tools that they use to analyze these kind of questions are anyway useful?
It would depend on the specific tools, because there's nothing prohibiting philosophers from employing methodologies that I would be perfectly okay with. So to give an example where a person is engaged in metaphysical inquiry, and I think the methods they use would be fine, it would be Dennett's approach to consciousness. So Dennett takes a broadly synthetic approach that incorporates findings from cognitive neuroscience and computer science and evolution and linguistics and just a broad range of empirical findings, couples that with philosophical considerations and thought experiments, a whole lot of thought experiments, and the end result is a sort of what I take to be a, broadly speaking, an abductive claim about, hey, here's a proposal about what's really going on when it comes to the matter of consciousness. Now, whether or not you endorse his conclusions, I think the methods are well integrated with the empirical sciences in a way that I consider healthy and a productive way of doing philosophy, in a way that directly addresses questions about what is or isn't. I mean, because he's addressing whether or not phenomenal states or qualia exist. And so there you have a metaphysical position that's staked out on grounds that I think fall roughly within the scope of what's available to analytic philosophers. It's just I don't think all, or probably not even most, analytic philosophers employ those sort of synthetic methods. And when they do, I think they may not do so as much as they ought to, because I think even Dennett probably could have been a bit more into the empirical stuff when it comes to stuff like free will. But not to say, I think he was at the top on a lot of these issues, and I just wish more philosophers were. I think a lot of philosophy is just far too armchair and too disengaged from the empirical sciences.
Okay. Because I'm thinking, you mentioned before with the Dennett stuff, he relied on thought experiments, and so you think intuition comes to useful at trying to get again at these kind of well, I know even though it uses the word intuition there, but cases of thought experiments are these other cases, are these other kind of methodologies, armchair methodologies. Again, are they themselves though going to be useful at getting at any kind of?
I think they can be, yeah.
So
I mean, thought experiments have been used in the sciences, so they're not like. There's nothing wrong with thought experiments. Just one has to understand what they can and can't do.
Yeah, what's an example of a thought experiment, or examples you would give to show? This is something that's actually these thought experiments are actually able to get at the kind of thing that we at the kind of truth that we're looking for.
The first one that comes to mind for me is in the inverted spectrum, but Dennett has several in Consciousness Explained. He has the what is it? He has that one about the Stalin-esque. He has a number of distinctions. I can't even remember the names for them. He has that one about the colored light that switches as you're watching it. I can't remember the name of that one. That I think is a helpful thought experiment. So I think there's a few that Dennett employs that are helpful in illustrating problems with conventional views about consciousness. But it's hard to recall specific ones that I would say this is a useful thought experiment off the top of my head. I mean, there you go. There's a few examples.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because you think cases of like what are examples of like thought experiments that I think are like how we think about like It's tricky because a lot of the time you're right, the thought experiments revolve a lot of time over semantic disputes. So if I'm thinking of Gettier cases, those kind of thought experiments or those cases may just not be useful, right? Because they're just dealing with areas that we may say is that there's semantic dispute over. And similarly, there may be cases I'm trying to think of thought experiments in free will literature, like Frankfurt cases. That just may also be semantic disputes over what we consider moral responsibility or acting freely to be. You don't think those kind of thought experiments would be useful then?
It depends what you like useful, for what purpose. So thought experiments, sometimes
useful,
serve.
I should be clear. When I say useful, yeah, I'm meaning like to get at certain to get at things that we consider true, like what we think exists. Those kind of questions.
Well, I think they can often be informative in an indirect way. So thought experiments, okay. So some of what Dennett is doing with thought experiments isn't so much like, here's a scenario, and I'm going to give you a choice between A or B, and that's going to tell you something about your concepts or terminology or whatever. Rather, he employs thought experiments to sort of prompt a change in your disposition to reason in a particular way. So, and we could be subject to certain rigid, ossified ways of seeing the world that cloud our ability to, think outside the box, to sort of wiggle out of the paradigms that are constraining our ways of thinking. And one of the things that thought experiments can do is get one to step outside that framework and think in a different way. And that can cause one to reconsider one's positions in light of occupying a sort of new conceptual vantage point. And in that respect, I think thought experiments can be quite successful, even if they don't decisively resolve any particular metaphysical issue. They don't, if they're they don't have to prompt a semantic judgment about anything, and yet they could still be valuable.
Okay. I'm curious. Also, is there any literature that you would say represents your view? Was a philosophy without intuitions? Do you think that's something that would represent it now?
No. So Capellan's that book is interesting, but I don't know that I fully agree with what's said in there. So no, I wouldn't appeal to philosophy without intuitions because that's a descriptive case. So Capellan's case in philosophy without intuition, that's what you're referring to, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that book is really saying, hey, lots of philosophers these days are using the term intuition and are it seems like it's this entrenched feature of analytic methodology, but actually it's not. And if you reanalyze historical cases, what you'll discover is that they weren't invoking intuitions. And so really it's a historical account of like what basically it's saying, hey, this is supposed to be the sort of standard meta philosophy of analytic philosophy, but actually that's not true. And so that's a descriptive case. I'm making more of a normative case of expressing my concerns about the use of intuitions. I don't know what to make of Capellan's case.
Okay. So yeah. So in case of what you're giving, then you say you're making more of a normative claim. What literature would you say represents your views?
What would I say represents my view? I mean, so my view is a sort of mosaic, a synthesis of a variety of other people's views. So I have this sense that there's very little that's unique or novel or distinctive about my point of view. It's very much a rehash of Wittgenstein and Schiller and James. Although I should say, much of this was developed sort of indirectly by directly engaging with philosophy and seeing a lot of criticism in, I guess you could say, secondary sources or third-hand accounts, developing a view on the basis of what I saw there, and then coming to realize I had sort of fallen back on or reconverged on the views that had probably motivated those views in the first place. So it's not like I read James and Wittgenstein and was like, this is the right view. It's more that I engaged with analytic philosophy, I saw the critiques of it, I found those compelling, and then I sort of circled back and realized, okay, so I held the views of these other people all along. So that's a roundabout way of addressing the question. I can just list off some variety of views and people whose influences have been really important. A big one is Stephen Stitch. Fragmentation of Reason is a cool book. It's a fairly short book, and it stakes out a sort of somewhat pragmatist view within the contemporary analytic landscape, although I no longer really endorse his specific view there because I've come to favor a more classical pragmatism of James and Schiller. So, but that did sort of causally and historically have a huge influence on me is Stephen Stitch's work. And Stitch's work has had an influence on me in other areas too. He has a great couple papers at least on his views on the moral domain. And he's also had a big influence on the development of experimental philosophy. So, within experimental philosophy, a lot of people have influenced me there. Edouard Machery, Josh Knobe. I could recommend specific stuff. So Stitch has a paper in the Atlas of Moral Psychology from, I think, 2018, edited by Kurt Gray, called The Moral Domain. And there's another great paper in there called, I think it's called something like Morality, a Historical Invention by Machery. And that one has had a big influence on me. Another paper that had one of the biggest influences on me of any is it's a chapter in Synod Armstrong's Handbook of Moral Psychology. I'm trying to remember when that was published. 2012, I think. Is it Synod Armstrong or Doris? Now I can't remember. Let me look it up. 1 second. I'm mixing up who the authors of old books are, as if 15 years ago is an old book. 1 second. Where is it? Doris. It is Doris. It's not Synod Armstrong. What am I talking about? So the Moral Psychology Handbook. That's the name. With Doris, and it has like trees on the front cover. So that has this awesome article. I think it's the first chapter in there, and it has a really frustrating title because it's so generic. It's hard to look it up. Called Evolution of Morality. And sorry.
No, I was laughing because it is very generic.
Yeah, it's so generic. It's impossible to find this thing. What's really cool about that paper, and some colleagues of mine, David Moss and Tyler Milhouse, we ended up writing a response to like a sentence from that paper on evolutionary debunking arguments. So whatever, I won't get into the details of that particular paper, but it's really, 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 really cool, and it's just great. You know what? Screw it, I'm going to do it anyway. So in that paper, they say, hey, so a lot of people will say that morality evolved. And that's an ambiguous claim. And you could break it down into at least 3 rough categories, maybe more. And those are some of the components of morality evolved, that a capacity for normative cognition evolved, or a capacity for a distinctive capacity to think in distinctively moral terms. So like moral cognition as a special type of moral normative cognition evolved. And when you disambiguate the claim in that way, you can then sort of distinguish, well, what's the evidence for each of these claims? And they end up basically saying that the evidence for some of the components would have to be assessed on a case-by-case basis, that the case for normative cognition having evolved is pretty strong, but that the case for a distinctive capacity for moral cognition is not very strong. And that had a big influence on me, and it affected how I viewed evolutionary debunking arguments. So that had a big influence on me. Okay, I'm giving a lot of examples. Okay, I'll give two more. One is Horwick's. Is it Horwick or Horwich? I don't know. Horwich. We'll say Horwich. Horwich's metaphilosophy. Horwich's book, Wittgenstein's Metaphilosophy. That is a really cool book. And another one is The Language Game by Chater, and it's Morton Christensen. Let me look up. Always goof up the names. Christensen and Chater, yeah. The Language Game. And that had a big influence on me too. Which, by the way, they also mention Wittgenstein in there right at the outset of the book. So, Wittgenstein's Metaphilosophy and The Language Game are a couple more big influences on me.
I'm also curious, by the way, because I know you mentioned evolutionary debunking stuff. It's a separate point, but I'm just curious your thoughts. What are your general thoughts on third factor responses? Like, do you think they beg the question?
Does what beg the question? Sorry.
Third factor responses to evolutionary debunking arguments.
No, I don't think so.
You don't think they?
You think they beg the question?
I don't know how I feel about them. I have to. Someone at my university does a lot of stuff on EDAs, and so they're very big into. They're very pro EDA, and they think it begs the question. So they send me some literature. I'm going to probably read about that more.
I encountered Fitzpatrick's response to them, and I didn't see a huge problem with that response. I don't know, and this was back in 2012, and I just started my master's in philosophy, so I don't know if I could remember it accurately, but very roughly, I understood Fitzpatrick to be saying something like, look, thinking in moral terms falls within the scope of general reasoning that is accessible for a variety of domains that is not distinctively subject to natural selection. We can reason about how to make good moves in chess. We could reason about how to do science properly. We could do physics and chemistry. And if moral reasoning falls within the same sort of general reasoning processes as those, there's no particular reason to single it out as something that would be subject to debunking, but not those other things. Now, that may or may not be an accurate representation of what Fitzpatrick said. I'm going to guess it's not, because it's just been so long since I looked at those papers. It's like 12, 13 years. But I think something like that is roughly a possibly plausible account. And that's in part motivated by my skepticism that there's something distinctive about moral cognition. I don't think moral cognition is itself a direct product of natural selection. I think it's culturally acquired.
That's interesting. You think, okay, because what a lot of time people do is they say that, look, if you want to start debunking on certain moral intuitions, you're now going to have to debunk on other kinds of intuitions. Or not intuitions, but maybe our moral reasoning faculties. You have to debunk on other type of reasoning faculties, like modal or evaluative. And that's the response I think people like Humer give. There are also a ton of other people who give this response. And I find this very odd because, look, I think, I'm not sure how you feel about people like Richard Drake's response to these kind of things. But look, I can make it. It makes sense why, like, my mathematical beliefs are going to be truth tracking to certain extents, right? If there's two lines in behind the bush, and I only think there's one, then that's just not going to be advantageous. But it's not really clear how having like true moral beliefs is in any way going to be advantageous, or why I need true moral beliefs. Like I could come up, there's not really any reason I would think. And so there's reason to say, hey, look, since this process, since evolutionary processes aren't going to be advantageous, since evolutionary processes are selecting based on certain traits being advantageous and not being truth tracking, and there's no reason for me to think that my moral beliefs are advantageous because they're truth tracking, unlike my other kinds of beliefs. My other beliefs may be advantageous because they're truth tracking. And it seems like I should be disregarding. At least I have some type of like undercutting defeater present here. So you're able to contain the problem only to the kind of moral intuitions and not have it outbranch into other kind of more problematic things like our evaluative judgments or mathematical judgments, etc.
I love that you use the word contain. You should check out our paper on this. It's called The Containment Problem in the Evolutionary Debunking of Morality. And that is exactly the issue that we talk about. So in the Evolution of Morality paper by Mashry and Mallon, they talk about this concern that, if a distinctive capacity for moral cognition did not evolve, in other words, like, let's step back for a second. If it did evolve, if it was subject to a particular set of selective pressures that led to the development of a specific cognitive faculty, let's even say it's like a special little module. So you have your visual system and your auditory system and your moral system. Yeah. Well, if that moral system arose to be responsive to a particular set of selective pressures, then one might say, okay, well, if those selective pressures weren't truth tracking, like all they had to do was facilitate reproductive fitness, they didn't have to, track what's true about the world, then there's a problem for morality, that we no longer have any reason to think that the outputs of our moral cognitive system are tracking moral truths. They're just, telling us to do what enhanced the reproductive fitness of our ancestors. Now, maybe that would be fine. Now, the problem is that suppose that it's not true that a distinctive capacity for moral cognition evolved, but rather that moral cognition falls within the ambit of general reasoning processes and systems that are culturally acquired. Well, now, if it's downstream of a general reasoning system and there's no substantive conceptual distinction, and these are views that I hold, so this isn't just hypothetical, between, quote unquote, moral normative judgments and non-moral normative judgments, then like normative judgments more generally, it's unclear whether whatever concerns you would have about moral normative judgments doesn't bleed out into all normative judgments, including epistemic norms, the very norms you would have used to evaluate the truth and falsehood of other sorts of things. And so if you're going to say that there's a distinctive problem for morality, and it's an evolutionary debunking argument of morality, then you're going to need to have some good reasons for, you're going to need to have some reasons for containing it. And one is, what you mentioned, that there's, so one thing is basically to say, okay, let's start by saying, okay, fine, you can't draw a distinction between the moral and non-moral norms, so we'll start with the presumption that maybe everything is debunked. And then you have to, as I think it was Tyler who used this term, redeem the other domains. And then as you systematically go through and redeem other normative domains, morality just never gets redeemed, and so it stays debunked. So that's one way. It's kind of a Cartesian skeptic way of doing things. Let's start with the presumption everything has been debunked. Now what can we salvage? So that's one approach that we talk about. And basically, and we talk about some others, what we do in the paper is we outline a number of ways of potentially addressing this containment problem. I don't reach any decisive conclusion on it. So it may be that future inquiry, because, none of us, I think, were or are experts specifically in evolutionary debunking arguments. What we were highlighting is the importance of engaging with the empirical literature on the actual evolutionary data concerning the evolution of moral and normative cognition more generally, and how that is of potentially enormous relevance to addressing these questions. And then it can't just be set aside. We don't, if you just operate with the morality evolved claim, that's just too underspecified to helpfully figure into addressing questions about how to, potentially contain morality. So maybe it could be contained and you could just debunk it and not a bunch of other stuff. Or, what I would do is probably just say, fine, you debunk all of it, and I'm a pragmatist, so I don't really care.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think I don't. Let me think for a moment.
Sure.
So, I think it's definitely an empirical question. I don't think that at least the way that EDA should be approached is by the armchair, and a lot of them actually aren't. There is a lot of philosophers seem to do is they set out certain kind of conditions that would need to be met in order for us to be more justified in EDAs. So, one paper, one of my friends of mine at the university here, one about evil lizard people. So we would define these evil lizard people, and we would, see how they act or see how they perform in certain ways, and we realize they're reason sensitive like us, but they just believe in like eating the young, right? Eating their young. Well, we would have reason to think, that maybe our moral faculties aren't involved in such a way that they're truth tracking if we could find such similar kind of beings or agents, or these other kind of empirical findings. It strikes me as odd, though, to think. So it depends on the other kind of reasons, the other kind of faculties that you're mentioning, like these kind of cultural. You call them cultural, reasonable, or culturally. What was the exact term you used? Something to do with deriving from culture, right?
I don't remember the exact term that I used.
But what would actually that refer to? Because the cases I'm giving right before, so like mathematical judgments, judgments about, and there are papers saying that if EDAs work, they should also work for mathematical realism too. I think that's fine. I think you could also hold like practical considerations. There has to be mathematical realism. But just to say that like my general evaluative judgments, I'd like to think are correct, and as well as my modal claims, like I like to think my belief that there aren't square circles is a correct belief. And I just don't see EDAs working the same for those beliefs, just because of how practical it is for me to have like correct knowledge about the external world, which my moral judgments aren't just giving me. But unless the claim's trying to be said, like I said, this is like some of the human response. If we have reason to think that our general reason faculties work in this area, then we should have reason to think it's also going to work in the moral domain. But I find that I'm so skeptical to think that like these are like we just have this one faculty. I think there are even studies on different like modularities for these things where you could isolate particular faculties. But I have to look more in the literature on that.
So I'm not going to endorse the modular views. I take a view that our capacity for reasoning in these domains is extremely plastic and highly culturally sensitive. I don't think humor is wrong in saying that. Like, hey, you have this sort of basic inductive inference, which is my reasoning works in this case, in this case, in this case, and keep listing another 50 other cases. So it probably works in the 51st case. And that's fine as a sort of starting heuristic. But in the specific case of morality, my concern is that so there's a couple concerns. First, in the case of mathematics or scientific reasoning and other sorts of domains of reasoning, like, I don't know, the examples I tend to give are things like engineering and chess. I use those two examples a lot. I use bridges and chess. Well, I have means of checking the veracity of my judgments in these domains against the world. If I have beliefs about whether or not this particular method of building a bridge will work versus that one, I can build a bridge and see if it still stands 10 years later. If I believe I'm better at chess than somebody else, I could play them. And if they completely obliterate me, then I'll learn, hey, maybe I'm not as good at chess as them. Whereas in the case of morality, I don't even know what would in principle constitute feedback for discovering whether your judgments were correct or not.
I agree with that. But the thing is, then why not just say, look, the problems now contained. We don't have to then go out to say our other types of faculties are now having to be debunked as well, right? Why? If I'm understanding your view, right? Because I mean, if I'm being pro DA here, I would say, look, yeah, that's great. Now we could just preserve our other kind of intuitions about these things. My modal intuitions, right? Even though I can't push back on these things, it aids me in survival. My mathematical intuitions to a certain extent, not in like the realist sense of mathematical intuitions, rather that, look, I'm correct at being able to identify objects. There's one lion in front of me instead of two lions. That's beneficial information and helps with my survival. Well, with moral facts, I just don't know how they push back. I don't know how much work we're getting out of evolution here. Like, even if we set aside evolution, I'm still going to have a problem with humor saying that he has judgments about what's morally right or wrong. And like, how can I, like, I don't have his judgments. How do I know what his judgments are about or whether they're true or not? Yeah.
What test could I possibly use if because keep in mind the sort of thing that someone like Humer and others are claiming that they have a capacity for. They have some special faculty for detecting moral facts that is private and inaccessible to me. And I can't detect what they're detecting in the world around me. What am I supposed to do? Just take their word for it? So they're claiming they have special access to these facts. Why should I believe them? And I just don't think that they have good answers to that question when I pose that question.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I think I'm sympathetic to like some of the like quietist intuitions about the like external reason talk or like moral talk more generally. But I know I like to even approach it, even if I were to have these intuitions, because I think I'm agnostic to whether or not I have such intuitions with these things. I don't know if when I'm presented with these cases, if I'm just projecting my intuitions onto someone else. Like, this father doesn't want to take care of his daughter. Does he have reason to take care of his daughter, right? I'm projecting. I don't know if I'm just projecting my intuition to say, well, he does have reasoning because I wanted to take care of his daughter, so I'm projecting that onto him. Or there actually are external reasons out there. So I'm agnostic to this matters, but even then, I would like to think, hey, like, if there is some way of criticizing the moral realist or critiquing the moral realist, I could agree with their intuitions about these things and just say they're misguided in some way. Or you have defeaters for these intuitions, and I'm in favor of EDAs, I think, but I am. Yeah, if you seem to be interested, you're skeptical of EDAs, which is funny.
I'm skeptical because I don't think moral reasoning is a distinctive product of evolution. So, like, I'm okay with a cultural debunking argument, but not an evolutionary debunking argument.
Yeah, well, what did I mention earlier that you said modularity? You disagree with some stuff on that. That's more of an empirical thing. So maybe do you have any what do you have to say about that? Because I don't know much about.
I mean, this idea of like massive modularity is something that was put forward. Oh, one moment. This idea of massive modularity, I just don't think that there's good evidence for it, and I don't think that it's. And I don't know if that's the specific view in question. So I'd rather just focus specifically on the question of when someone claims that moral judgment, like the cognitive states involved in moral judgment evolved, what exactly is the claim? Are they claiming that we have a special faculty for moral cognition and that this is some sort of pan-cultural tendency that reliably emerges in every culture? If so, what are its origins? What's its etiology? How does it develop? How does it function? What are the mechanisms involved? There's a lot of empirical questions here. And just saying morality evolved is just so vague and underdeveloped, I don't know what that means. And I don't think the people saying that know what they mean. And if they do, they should be clear about what it is they're saying. If someone's going to say that moral judgments are somehow undermined by the fact that the sort of contributing psychological factors that are prompting the judgment or influencing the judgment in some way were not selected for because they were truth tracking, it's not clear to me why this applies to moral judgments but not other sorts of judgments. And if someone says that it does, I want to get clear on what they think a moral judgment is and why this applies to them and not others. And they're going to need an account there, not me. Like I could throw up my hands and say I don't know. Like what's their account?
Yeah. Okay. Do you think that in cases of, like if someone wanted to hold to EDAs, what other areas should they be consistent in to also, like what other kinds of faculty are, well, I'm saying faculties as if there's more than one faculty here. I don't want to like presuppose anything, but what other kind of beliefs should also then come into question, you think?
Well, so I'll just give an example. I'm not, okay, so I mentioned two papers. I mentioned the moral domain. And in that paper, what Stephen Stitch does is he says, look, there have been efforts both within psychology and philosophy to identify or delineate the distinctive set of characteristics that distinguish moral norms from non-moral norms. You could say moral judgments from non-moral judgments. And, that would be something like a nomological clustering of metanormative properties. So there's something like authority independence or stance independence, or they could be identified by the content, like what they're about, or the cognitive systems involved in the judgments, or their severity. There's a variety of ways that one could cash out, this is what moral judgments are, and the rest of the stuff, these aren't moral judgments. And, to give one example, one of the most well-developed and famous examples within moral psychology is the moral conventional distinction. And this was put forward by Turiel, and other people have been involved in this research. So what they did is they developed this thing called the moral conventional task. So you go to a group of kids, and part of the reason for studying this in children is to minimize the potential influence of culture. You see how early it emerges, and that could potentially be used to argue that it's more of something that's innate and shared across cultures. I don't know that Turiel ever made strong claims like that, but other people looking at that literature did. Okay, so what you do is you say, okay, well, let's say the teacher says you could talk in the middle of class. Would it be okay to talk in the middle of the class? Kids tend to say yes. Mm-hmm. And then you go through a set of others, like how serious is this violation? Why is it bad when people break the rule? And do you think kids in other parts of the world would be subject to this rule? And for something like, talking in the middle of class, kids will tend to say the teacher can override the rule if they want to, that it doesn't necessarily apply in other contexts. And I don't know exactly what they'd say about why it's wrong. If they do say it's wrong, maybe the teacher said so or something like that. And the severity condition was eventually dropped from this literature because it wasn't reliable. So you get so that's how like a social convention is construed. In contrast, a moral violation is seen as it's authority independent. The authorities can't override the rule. It's wrong in terms of harm, justice, or fairness, and it is universally applicable to children in other parts of the world. And so you get this if you give kids a bunch of what you a priori classify as conventional rules and moral rules, and they attribute these three properties to the moral rules but not the non-moral rules. Boom! It looks like you've identified this psychological pattern that emerges early in children, and it causes them to distinguish moral from non-moral norms. And it could be used as evidence of a shared universal capacity for engaging in moral cognition. The problem is that that distinction both doesn't hold up within Western populations and completely breaks down in some Western and many non-Western populations. So when you actually broaden the scope of it, this doesn't uphold everywhere. It's quite good research, but it's culturally contingent. So that's the sort of thing that you find in psychology, and then in philosophy, I think it's just all over the place. There's just never been a good characterization of what morality is. So what I'm driving at here is, I don't even think that morality, moral norms constitute a conceptually distinct domain in the first place. It's a little weird to say I'm debunking morality. What exactly is it that you're debunking? And that's one of the first questions proponents of evolutionary debunking arguments of morality, on my view, would need to address. They need to address what they're debunking. And it's not going to fly to just say, well, I'm debunking morality. Well, what is that?
Yeah, I guess what you're saying. So if I'm understanding it right, then there seems to be some literature saying that there is, if there is mass moral disagreement amongst populations, it shouldn't be then thought of that we get our moral beliefs from evolutionary processes, rather we get our moral beliefs culturally.
Yeah, well, I'm not talking about moral disagreement, just to be clear, if not to you, then to the audience, that this is not normative moral disagreement. So this isn't like some places the people say it's okay to hit people and some people they don't. It's that we haven't identified any distinctive any characteristics that allow us to say these are judgments about moral issues and these other judgments, these are not about moral issues. There's no, here's a very crude way to put it. I don't think moral judgments are a natural kind.
Okay, I see what you're saying. That's interesting. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I see. Well, what is it that makes something moral? Basically, cultural consensus in our disposition to call them moral. And I think what you'll find is that the term is used in so variable and muddled a way in everyday discourse and there's so much normatively baked into the use of the term moral that it's not even like it's this descriptive appellation that's used in English or any other language that I'm aware of that reliably distinguishes one set of norms from other norms. Rather, it's highly variable and disorganized in its use. So attempts to see if even participants within the same test population will agree on what is or isn't a moral issue consistently find that they don't. They just don't consider things moral. Like what, you'll find a population where half of the people will say, yeah, abortion's not a moral issue. It's a personal matter. Falls outside the scope of morality. What the heck does that mean? Why are personal issues outside the scope of morality? What do they mean by that? I don't know. You'd have to ask them. But when you're talking about the same population, I think the hope there's over 7,000 languages in the world. The hope that you're going to get clear cognate terms across cultures and languages and that they're all going to pick out a domain in the same way, I think is a fool's errand. And, Mashery and Stitch I think both of them are involved. I know Mashery is in some cross-cultural research to look at how people classify norms in different cultures. And in those two chapters, I forget which one it is. I think it's in Mashery's chapter, Morality and Historical Invention. It discusses some of the preliminary data. Some of that data has subsequently been published that looks at differences between religious groups. And the other looks at, I don't know if it's linguistic groups or nationality or something. But basically, when you go to different cultures and you do surveys in different languages, and you give people a big list of norms, and you say, how would you categorize these? They don't do so in a way where it's cross-culturally like it's not always the same as like Americans. So different people appear to have different conceptions of how to carve up the normative concept space. And so it's not clear to me that there's any shared universal conception that comports with a distinctively Western conception of morality. I think morality, at the term as it's understood in English, picks out a rough cluster of largely culturally idiosyncratic normative categories that they don't have any clear or well-defined boundaries. Sorry to say so much on that. It's a big issue.
No, I think that makes sense then, right? If the proponent of EDAs is trying to say that, look, our beliefs about these things are evolved from evolutionary processes, but it's not really so clear exactly what it means to say we have beliefs about these things. Like, what are the things that we have beliefs about? The thing in question is kind of under suspect, and I think that's fair, right?
Yeah, let me give an example. Like, take a distinctive code of like medieval chivalry. Imagine if someone said, "I have an evolutionary debunking of medieval chivalry." I mean, my immediate response would be, "Well, medieval chivalry isn't a product of natural selection. What are you talking about?"
Yeah, you're calling into question those kind of things. Interesting. But that's because, yeah, I'd have to see, I guess, empirical work on that as well, because a lot of people, when they take, even for like anti-realists, they have a certain like feeling when they associate with like moral claims. Like when I say like, there's a difference between me saying, look, we have a disagreement in preferences. I like anchovies on pizza, and you don't like anchovies on pizza, and you think it's okay to steal, and I think it's not okay to steal, or stealing more generally, right? So we associate, I think, different kinds of attitudes towards those things that aren't just like disagreements, like the kind of disagreements we have when it comes to preferences. There seems to be something substantive there, and so that kind of feeling that's being that's emerging, I would think, would be something of evolutionary byproduct.
Yeah, I don't think that it is. I think it's a culturally acquired tendency to call some things moral and some things not. And I think that if you look into cross cultural work on like different languages, different cultures, you'll find that they don't draw the distinctions in the same way, and they often have their own terminology for things that does not map on to like Western. It doesn't have Western cognate terms.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I'm thinking of like other cases where, like, if someone told me like, oh look, I have certain beliefs that green and red are like different colors, right? But someone says, well, like that's just a cultural byproduct that you happen to think that green and red are different colors. Like that seems so odd for me to think about that. Where I clearly could, these seem like just distinct things to me.
Yeah, well, there's a couple things to say about that, which is that color categorization does vary from one culture to another. That doesn't mean that people literally have different visual systems. I mean, that'd be pretty silly. But the color categories at least vary from one culture to another. And there's at least some empirical evidence that language can influence, at the very least, the speed at which you identify color distinctions. So it's not going to affect like your actual visual perception. But I suspect culture does play some, if very minor, role in influencing certain aspects of visual perception. So, like the Mueller-Lyer illusion isn't present in every culture. There's cultural variation, even literally in visual perception.
Yeah, because I was going to say there's certain cases where, for sure, I'm thinking light green versus dark green would be an instance where I would for sure think, yeah, that I can understand someone calling it the same color, and someone in a different culture thinking those are two different colors. But in other cases, there seems to be something non-cultural about my distinctions. And like there's some biological byproduct in my ability to distinguish certain things, or at least my biology, my evolutionary processes play some role in being able to make these kind of distinctions. Even if there's cultural,
Yeah, that seems very plausible, but then we could also point to the physical mechanism that could account for that, which is that people have three different types of cones. So there is a physiological factor we could point to that would account for why there would be some shared overlap in people's tendency to draw similar distinctions across cultures. So in that case, you could point to the specific physiological factors that are associated with that sort of shared tendency. And I would ask, what's the analog for morality? And I think the answer is going to be that there isn't one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting still. Like, I'm trying to think of other cases where a distinction could be made, maybe, where, like, here's a good example, maybe. I'm curious what your thoughts are on this now, right? I'll probably go in a minute after this as well, but, a case of, if someone wants to say, well, what do you take I was talking before about intentional actions. What do you take an intentional action to be, right? Like, can we distinguish someone who happens to fall down, right, by, like, tripping, versus someone who goes through the motions but then brings themselves down like they're an actor or something? Or cases where, my heart is beating, right, versus cases where, like, I deliberately move my hand up. Or all these other cases where it seems to be I'm making a distinction between what I think to be an action that's intentional and an action that just is non-intentional, right? I mean, that's a distinction. That kind of distinction has nothing to do. Maybe there actually is going to be an underlying neurological difference. That's not the point I'm trying to get at. I'm saying I'm able to like mentally classify types of behaviors, some as actions, some as non-actions, just on the basis of kind of my intuitions about these things. There seems to be something that's related amongst all these kind of things I would say to be intentional, right? Where I'm going to drink water, or I'm moving my hand up, or I'm talking, as opposed to me sweating, shaking, tripping, all these other things. I'm able to make distinctions between them. So I mean, this seems like is it not going to happen? Like the same thing we think for morality. Do you not think that there's this particular kind of again, intuition is a very tricky word you mentioned before, but a kind of feeling or association that you get with certain moral claims that you're not getting with other kind of disagreements in regards to preference.
Is there a question in there? I'm sorry if there's a question that got lost in the mix.
Yeah, sorry. I was just trying to get a setup here. My question is just this: there still seems to be, even if what we categorize as moral or not moral issues, there seems to be at least some intuition about that differentiates moral disagreements from other kind of preference-based disagreements, even if we're going to think that morality, even under an anti-realist notion of morality. And so whatever that thing is, that seems like it's something distinct, and I don't know what it would mean for it to be cultural, that kind of thing that's being elicited, that kind of feeling or sensation, that kind of the phenomenology of how I deploy moral concepts, or how I recognize things as something being immoral.
Yeah, what I'm questioning is whether I'm not sure all cultures have shared moral phenomenology or concepts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, okay, yeah.
Like we would have to get specific about what this concepts and phenomenology are, and then it's going to be an empirical question what cultures have it. Now, sometimes people misunderstand that to be the suggestion that there are cultures where they don't have normativity at all, and so like they just have no notion that it's like bad to steal or hurt people, and so they're all just evil or totally amoral, and that is absolutely not at all what I'm claiming. Think of if someone said I don't believe in morality, but I follow the code of let's say they have a god, or they have a particular religion, or they have a code of chivalry. Chivalry I don't take to be identical to contemporary Western conceptions of morality, and someone could follow a chivalric code, and depending on the content of it, they may or may not be a perfectly reasonable person to get along with. The point here is just to say, well, what are the distinctive metanormative properties of morality? What is morality about specifically? What is it constituted by? And other cultures may have somewhat different normative concepts, or very different normative concepts, that they employ to regulate their conduct and their actions. And they may regard those categories as sui generis. Now, I don't want to speculate too much about human cultures and societies because I don't know enough about them, and because there's going to be actual facts of the matter about human cultures and societies. And so I'm not comfortable speculating, like in the absence of any data on the matter. And so what it's best to do in this case is invoke a thought experiment about aliens and talk about like hypothetical, I mean, I guess it's not a thought experiment in the sense that I'm going to prompt an intuition, but one could imagine, I think, an alien society that has a sui generis normative system, like, the one I tend to give when I talk about this are the Zorpians. And so the Zorpians can say, look, we've studied human morality. We understand that you have these moral concepts. We don't have those. We have Zorpian concepts. And Zorpian concepts are these primitive, unanalyzable, sui generis notions about appropriate conduct, and they're very different from your conduct. They do result in us judging that you shouldn't cause wanton destruction and harm other people. And they might not even say shouldn't. They might say your notions of should and good and ought not, those belong to your distinctive moral concepts. And our concepts are they're sui generis, and so they're different. And so we need an analog. And so we would say you zouldn't and you zould do things. And there's facts about what's zoud and what's zad. And we operate within that framework. And they could get along just fine with that framework, and it would not be morality. And it would not be morality as a matter of stipulative fiat. They're saying, look, we've studied your morality. What we're talking about is sui generis. It's not that as a matter of stipulation. So if you want to tell us we're conceptually confused or we're mistaken or whatever, that's fine, but our system is our system, and we're not operating on your system. And I don't know that they would be making any obvious conceptual mistakes that couldn't be paralleled in one's critique of morality itself. I don't know if that example is helpful.
Yeah, In the case of these aliens, though, the kind of differences that we may have from them, are those going to be just like physiological differences, or there are differences also in just like culturally? Like these sui generis states are just they emerge about from they emerge from cultural differences, or they emerge because of physiological differences. Because I'm not sure what it would mean for them to emerge from cultural differences. That's what I'm saying.
Well, they would have a different culture, so why couldn't they emerge from cultural differences?
Yeah, I guess I hear. Yeah, I don't know. That seems very odd to think. Like there's certain kind of like experiences that I could have towards things that are that even though that two physiologically identical people could have, but that the experiences are just going to be different on the basis of cultural interpretations. And so odd.
Right, but how do you distinguish those cases from cases where the experiences are genuinely different? So you could have cases, in other words, where the phenomenology is the same, but there's cultural differences in how one interprets the phenomenology, and cases where the phenomenology is different. And you could even have cases where the phenomenology is different, but the interpretations are convergent, and so they end up thinking that they have the same experiences when they don't.
So repeat that one more time. What's the...
So you could have cases where two people have different phenomenology but report the same experience, and cases where people have the same phenomenology but report different experiences.
Yeah, then the question: when they report different experiences, are they actually experiencing different things? But I guess they wouldn't be if they're having the same phenomenology.
Yeah,
Uh,
I'm just stipulating that these strike me at least as like prima facie possibilities, and then you could get into like, you know, whether that's actually possible or not, because
yeah,
I'm a
that's
qualia
fine.
denier, so some
Yeah,
elements of this are not even going to be possible on my view.
yeah, that's fine.
So like I
Obviously,
think inverted spectrum is literally impossible.
yeah, yeah, that's fine. Like in cases of people having the same physiological similarities, if they report different experiences, I think is much different than saying they actually have different experiences from each other. That I find like impossible. That there are going to be cases where you could keep the same physiological like brain physiological states. It just experience everything seems
Well,
odd.
yeah, I mean, we could point to actual examples of this because you could ask people to like imagine a purple cow, and it turns out some people vary in the degree of mental imagery, like how like rich their mental imagery is, and there's some people that don't have any mental imagery, and a lot of these, it's not like people immediately when they're like 4 years old are like, where's my mental imagery? I don't I appear not to have it. People have discovered when they're in their 20s or 30s or probably even older and later in life, like hold up, when you say you're imagining a purple cow, you're seeing a purple cow in your mind, like literally. I thought that was a metaphor, And so people can get through life where someone's like, okay, imagine a purple cow. Now imagine it walking down the street and do this and do that in your mind. And the person without mental imagery could be doing that for years, and then realize their phenomenology is radically different from other people's phenomenology, and they never noticed. And so it appears like we can have different phenomenology. We could talk about it in roughly the same way, but that doesn't mean it's actually identical, because it's discoverable that our phenomenology is actually different if you do a bit more digging. And I do think those are interesting cases. And I do think it's possible that we could run into some alien species and they have a weird kind of phenomenology that's very different from our own, and they report sui generis concepts about their own normative ideals and concepts. They could insist as a matter of stipulation that they're not reducible to moral considerations. And I don't know what we could say in principle that could show that they're mistaken or misguided or wrong.
I think I agree with you there. Yeah. My comment was just coming out to say, I can't imagine a case. I can't imagine having different, you know, phenomenal experiences with someone, yet we have the same physiological, structure or content.
Oh, sure. I mean, if you're, but I mean, everybody's a little different. So it could be that like you're both, there's activation in the, you know, ventromedial prefrontal cortex in two people that looks pretty similar. But I mean, there's enough idiosyncrasies in each brain that it's possible you're actually having different experiences.
That's fine as well. You could have So whatever. All I was saying is that it seems like my certain experiential differences are going to be in some way or another just contingent on if there's a difference in something, some sort of physiological difference. I can think of it just as it being what's the word I'm looking for? I'm I'm blanking on the term here. Why am I? Uh, I don't know. I'm blanking on the term for some reason.
That's okay. That happens to me.
Yeah, I could decide. I
Yeah,
could decide
I'm
it.
certainly not going to think you could have different phenomenologies, but physically identical mental states.
Oh,
I don't think
supervenience.
that
There we
happens.
go. That's what I'm looking. I'm looking for supervenience. So yeah,
Yeah,
I think there
so
has to be a difference in something physiological in order to allow for this
I agree.
theoretical
Yeah,
difference. Yeah.
we're certainly not going to disagree on that. I'm not. No one's going to catch me being an accidental dualist.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's fine. I'll look more into the studies though, because that's interesting. Yeah. If it comes to be that a lot of the EDA stuff is just going to be based on like certain like misassumptions about how exactly like what exactly these quote unquote evolved moral faculties are, and it really they're just going to be downstream of cultural differences, or some cultural byproduct, and there really is no faculty about these kind of beliefs. And yeah, that would definitely hurt EDAs, I think.
Yeah. Now I think it hurts EDAs, but I just favor cultural debunking arguments.
Yeah, how would you shift it?
Yeah, so my specific shift has to do with saying that what I think is going on is that the disposition for thinking in distinctively moral terms, and well, I'll focus on philosophers. So I think that judgments that there are stance independent moral facts are a downstream byproduct of problems in contemporary, like in the methods of contemporary analytic philosophy, but there's also some sociological and historical factors involved here. I think Nietzsche basically gets it right that, and that very roughly something like this has happened and this is not an attempt at a reconstruction of what Nietzsche says. This is just, if this is Nietzschean and inspired, then insofar as it's good, give it credit to him. As far as it's terrible, blame me. So I don't want to take any credit here. But what I think has happened is basically, as the world became increasingly secularized, philosophers scrambled in that sort of existential void left by the sort of metaphorical death of God and the lack of an ability to ground the authority of their moral systems and a sense of meaning and purpose in the universe and a divine being. They sort of attempted to transplant those strong desires to externalize one's standards and values to something other than oneself in new territory. And instead of abandoning it and going full existentialist, they sort of replanted all of that in the fertile Platonic fields that were readily available to them in the historical canon of philosophy that was available to them. And so what I think happened is that people, after thousands of years of growing up in a society in which people were brought up to believe there's a God and there's good and there's evil and these are cosmic forces that are outside of us and that God created us with a plan and a purpose. I mean, thousands and thousands of years until that is completely entrenched in every mode and aspect of our life. It's part of our cultural motifs. It's in our movies. Watch a movie like The Watchmen and you have the deontologist and the utilitarian and there's good and evil and this is everywhere in pop culture and people were just totally saturated in this. So though that tendency is something that was ingrained in people to judge things as morally good or bad in a way that you pick up from your culture. And it doesn't feel like, because it isn't a mere expression of one's own emotions. So, to give one example, people might feel guilty if they look at someone lustfully. Now, is that inconsistent? Does that mean that it's not clearly connected to their desires directly because they actually desire the other person and then feel like that's wrong? Is that sense that it's wrong part of like a direct part of their desires in the way that like food preferences are? No, it's something that's culturally internalized from the culture around them. So, but it doesn't feel like it's coming from you because it's something your society ingrained in you. So if someone tells you something about you is something you should feel guilty or shameful of, your culture can give you a sense that things are good or bad in a way that is not stemming from your own desires and feelings. It feels like it's coming from the outside because it is, but it's not coming from God, and it's not coming from a special faculty for detecting moral facts. It's coming from your culture. So basically what I think is that cultures instilled in people in Western civilization an external sense that things can be good or bad in some deep metaphysical sense. And I think philosophers have that. They're brought up in that culture. They have that sense. And I think that they've mistaken that sense that they have, like, oh, wow, certain things feel good, feel right, seem wrong, seem bad. It doesn't seem like it's part of my desires. I must have a faculty for detecting these facts. And I think that they're just picking up on what their culture has taught them.
Yeah. The one thing I would say with that, though, is I guess the moral realist could respond the same way that they sometimes respond to EDAs, just by saying, well, look, it may be the case that our moral beliefs aren't, again, tracking these things and that they're culturally sensitive. But if moralism is true, and it happens to be that there's certain things that are good, the kind of same response you could take that Enoch gives, but you just kind of parallel it with this kind of this cultural relative account. Is, well, it happens to be society or cultures are mirroring this for this reason. So it's the case that we get it because of their culture, but the culture is getting it because it's actually the case that it's true. And so we can make a similar kind of through-factor response with this as well.
Yeah, and they can argue things like moral convergence. Humor does that, and so they could say stuff like, "Look, it's not so much that culture instilled in us some non-truth tracking sense that there's a right and wrong. It's that our culture has taught us what's right and wrong." And they could say to me, "Look, Lance, you're the one that says all of this stuff is a product of culture. Don't you even think mathematics is a product of culture? Isn't engineering a product of culture?" And I would have to say, in a certain sense, yes. Although what I would then have to point to is what I pointed to, early when we got onto this topic, which is that in those cases, I would take a pragmatic approach to them and say, well, I find out whether engineering is telling me about what the world is like by testing it against the world. And I find out whether math is telling me about what the world is like by testing it against the world. We know that our mathematics works well because we could land probes on Mars. Can I do a similar test with my moral judgments? And I think the answer is no. There's no way of checking, verifying, predicting, confirming. There's no empirical process for verifying those beliefs. And so when I start putting them through the sort of, it's all grist for the pragmatic mill, and engineering and mathematics are vindicated by their utility, and moral judgment isn't. And that's what ends up happening for me.
Yeah, because I also think I feel that they could respond by, look, we have these consistent moral judgments, though. Or they could say, look, we could do this kind of, I think this is what Parker does to verify the accuracy of certain moral judgments. It's just by, running them to make sure they're consistent with other things. You could do thought experiments, you could think through these matters consistently. And when you're doing that kind of endeavor, that's how you're being able to, see the accuracy. Same thing for mathematics. I may not know whether or not the mathematical properties exist, but I can tell you if my mathematical system is coherent if it fits together with all the parts of the mathematics, right? But there could be, coherent in whatever kind of way that mathematicians determine coherency. I don't really know.
Yeah. Coherence isn't going to be enough, though, because I'm still going to ask the question, okay, so you have these two systems that are both coherent. What's the difference? What do they do? And if the answer is there's no difference, then I think the distinction is probably meaningless and superfluous and should be dropped.
What do you mean? What distinction?
So if you have two theories, and you say, hey, these theories are very different about what they say about what the world is like, and they're both internally coherent, first of all, that's going to be a problem already, because, okay, so now you got two coherent theories. How do you determine which one is true? What I would say is, well, what differences would they make? Suppose one is true, suppose another is true. What differences would I observe between these two systems being true? And I think for a lot of the abstruse metaphysical theories, the answer is none. There are no differences. And that is what I take to be an indicator that they are at best practically superfluous. But I would also say neither of these accounts are true because they don't make any difference.
This seems odd, though, right? Because there are cases where I could, someone could posit me some type of explanation for some phenomena. I think, since the Inwagon's example, I could say, I have this pot of water on my stove, and it's boiling because of the flame. Or I could have an alternative account that says, well, it's boiling, and it's the act of it boiling is overdetermined. It's boiling because of the flame and because of this invisible substance called boilo, which is always present when a fire is there, boiling water. And that account is going to be perfectly coherent. I could always reference my boilo fire account, or I could just reference the regular fire account. It just seems so it seems so much easier to say, the reason why this is boiling has nothing to do with boilo. This is just not something it's useful to posit, even though the system is coherent. So there seems to be a way I could compare two coherent systems and still favor one over the other, right?
Yeah, I think you can.
Okay, so what do you think? Is it just basing on theoretical virtues? In the case of the boiler example, we'd probably have to rely on that.
Yeah, which theoretical virtues I stuck with would themselves be subordinate to their pragmatic like a pragmatic test. So
Okay.
if parsimony ended up not working well, I would drop parsimony. But I think it does work well in practice.
Yeah, and so the question becomes, well, for your pragmatic considerations, are these also considerations on how do these considerations bear on what you find true? So in the case of the Borlo example, I just don't think I have the belief that the thing causing it. I think it's true that the thing causing it is the fire. I don't think it's true that the thing causing it is the fire in Borlo. Not just for like practical reasons. Like that's a belief that I have. Is it also going to apply the same thing for your kind of? Maybe it's my lack of understanding pragmatism properly, but with that also.
No, the distinction is going to collapse. Its truth just is its value in the broader context of the rest of my beliefs. So it's not, what a pragmatist is not going to do is say, hey, in this isolated case, this particular belief would be useful to me, and therefore it's true. What you have is a kind of process of integration within your broader framework for the way that you think about things. So a sort of locally useful belief, if you attempted to incorporate that into your sort of web of the rest of your beliefs, it's going to ripple across the rest of your beliefs and cause a bunch of problems if you believe something silly and superfluous and inconsistent. It might at least be cognitively demanding to keep track of a bunch of superfluous fluff in your network of beliefs. And so it's going to be beneficial to have a sort of tight, compact, internally coherent framework. So the pragmatist is very much going to be concerned with coherence as a matter of practicality. And so truth is in part going to be subordinate to those sort of background considerations. It's not like the pragmatist just assesses everything piecemeal. Things are assessed holistically.
Okay, that's okay. That's fair.
And so the pragmatist is going to end up having a view that is going to very easily parallel the judgments that you would get from a scientific realist. So the realist is going to say, this account better tells us what the world is like actually like. This is the correct scientific theory for this, and this reason. And that other theory is bad for this, and this reason. So they would say, a heliocentric model is way better than a geocentric model. And they would point to all the observations and data. And the pragmatist would look at that and go, I agree, this is the better model. But whereas one of them is saying it's better because it's tracking like what reality is really like, in a certain like correspondence sense, the pragmatist is just going to say, I have no need of that additional posit, but they're going to end up agreeing. So it's not quite going to take a deflationary approach. That might even be going further than and more minimalist than the pragmatist. But the pragmatist is going to be able to have all the conceptual resources to do what people do with all their fancy metaphysics without the fancy metaphysics.
Okay, that's fair. Okay, yeah, maybe I'll have to. I've been meaning to read also more into just debates between pragmatists and correspondence theorists and whatnot. I would think to myself, at least I'm a correspondence theorist, and so I have those kind of tendencies anyway. So when I hear pragmatists or other deflationists talk about things, I have to keep in mind that we're probably approaching these questions from different angles anyway. So, but that's fair. Okay. I have to go anyway to go grocery shopping, but it was great talking. So.
Awesome. Yeah, I had a lot of fun. This feels like this is a very long conversation, but go do what you got to do.
Thank you. Yeah.
Awesome. Take care. All right. I don't know how long that went, but it feels like that was at least an hour, right? So I'm very sorry to the other guests that may have requested and are no longer here. Let me check if there's people. Yeah, there's no guests. So what I will say about that, for anybody that requests and you don't get a chance to talk to me, a couple things. First, if you really want to talk to me, I'm happy to talk to as many people as I possibly can. So you can always DM me. I'm also very accessible elsewhere. So I'm on YouTube as Lance Independent. I have a blog, Lance Independent. I got about pages and contact information, so you can get in touch. So if there's stuff you want to talk to me about, I know it might be really desirable to talk to me like right at the time, and then later you're like, forget about it. So if I don't get a chance to talk to you, I apologize, but I am reachable if you want to talk to me. The second thing is, if I'm talking to someone, I want conversations to take their natural course. If a person is being like frustrating and rude, that we might only talk for a minute. If a conversation seems productive and valuable, I'm going to keep talking. And if that's an hour and a half, I'm going to do it. And I want to extend that same courtesy to everybody I talk to, so that there's, sometimes I feel like, if a person starts using their tone starts implying they want to go, or they've had enough of the conversation or whatever, then, we'll move on. But, if someone if the conversation seems good and I'm enjoying it, I'm just going to keep talking. And I guess my point here is that sometimes that will mean that I don't get to talk to other people that want to talk to me, but put the shoes on their feet. If I were talking to them and the conversation is good and productive, I'm not going to drop them either. So, I guess that's an incentive to have a good conversation with me, which is that if it's a good conversation, I'm not going to drop you unless I need to, like I have to go or something. So I do have to go fairly soon. So I guess so no more requests. I'll just talk to chat. So let's close out today's. What did I talk to? Two people? That was wild. How long was that? When did I start this? I don't even remember. Whatever. It reminds me. I used to have conversations. So when I was doing my master's, I did a master's in philosophy at Tufts. I had. I had a friend there where we would just talk, and sometimes it would just be hours and hours and hours, and we would even revisit conversations. And that kind of long form conversation, I'm sure many people, like professional philosophers, have those conversations. And what I find really frustrating and is a huge bummer for philosophy is it's overly academic. Oh, give me 1 second. I have to address one thing in real life. One moment. Okay, it's settled. I am going to be walking my dogs fairly soon. So that is what I'm going to be doing because we got nice weather here. Okay, so, when it comes to academic philosophy, I have lots of criticisms, but basically, here's one thing I'll say about that. So the way that your career advances in academic philosophy is that you're expected to publish in academic journals. So basically, you have these publishers, and they host journals, and the journals have editors. The editors manage submissions to the journal. When they receive submissions to the journal, and usually the journals cover specific topics, and they focus on particular things like ethics or logic or whatever, is some social psychology, or it could be something really specific. So when you submit to them, that editor, they'll look over the paper. If it's suitable for the journal and they think it's worth sending out for review, they'll send it out for review. If not, they'll just tell you no, and that's a desk rejection. Like, you're not going to get published here. So they send it out to reviewers, and it goes through this whole review process. I'm not getting into the whole process. The issue is that career advancement is largely predicated on the degree to which you publish in what are considered prestigious or like highly accredited journals by sort of popular acclaim. And there's various sorts of metrics that are used for like how much papers and how like the some ratio of how often the papers in the journal are cited, that sort of thing. Anyway, so what that does is it incentivizes philosophers, because there's many more people with PhDs in philosophy that would love to be professional philosophers and work as professors than there are positions available. And so how do they compete with one another? Well, you get more papers in more top journals. And so a lot of the career focus has shifted towards the publishing of articles. There's less emphasis on publishing books. There's less emphasis on having discussions. If you want to have a wonderful, productive career in philosophy where you get tenure and you have job security and you get paid well and you advance your career and you get the cool positions and you get invited as a keynote speaker and you get all the good stuff, you're not going to be spending your days on TikTok. You're not going to be spending your days doing what I'm doing. You would be spending your days writing papers and trying to publish them. And I think that's really unfortunate, because what it does is it narrows what good philosophy is down to the style of writing and the way and the length and the duration and the tone that is considered most acceptable for academic philosophy journals. So books, you could take a different tone. Books, you have room to really explore your ideas. Conversations, you have back and forth, you have feedback. I mean, think about, Western philosophy. It loves to pat itself on the back and look at its own history and go, oh, it's so wonderful. It loves to sniff its own philosophical farts. And, take its supposed founder, Socrates. What did Socrates write? Nothing. What did Socrates do? He went around having conversations with people. Went around having conversations with people on the street. That's the equivalent of what I'm doing, what Danny from Phil Tuck is doing. And that, no one gives a crap about that, because we're not publishing in journals. And I think that's really unfortunate. Now, that is not at all to knock journals. I think essays are wonderful. Essays can be that you take the time to organize your thoughts and present. You could present an argument in a much more structured way than I'm able to do readily in a live format. So articles are wonderful. You could get feedback from your colleagues and really refine your argument and have something awesome. It's like crafting a sculpture. Whereas what I'm doing is like, I don't know, these are really lame analogies, improvised dance, right? Or freestyling or something. But I just want there to be a plurality of ways to recognize and appreciate work that is done, and that could be blogging, it could be articles, it could be mentoring people. Teaching is not as appreciated as it should be. You would think it would be appreciated, and to some extent it can be, but it's not like the people that advance their careers the most. It's like you could just get there by being an incredible teacher. Why not? What if you're the I don't see why not. So there's lots of ways that basically I think that academia needs to focus less on metrics. So look up this thing if you get a chance called Goodhart's Law, and let me see if I could recall exactly how I would state the law. That when a measure ceases to be a good measure when it becomes the target. And roughly what that means is if you have some target, like you want to evaluate people's ability to do something or how good they are at something, and you come up with some test or way of measuring it, what ends up happening is it's initially intended to be a proxy for evaluating how good you are at that other thing. But what do people start doing? They start trying to game the system by just getting really good at doing the test. And once they do that, the test stops being a good test of what it's a proxy for. So what people start doing, a good test is a test where it's an accurate measure of how good you are at some target, goal, or objective, or outcome, or whatever. But if people are super aware of what your measure is, they could just focus on being good at getting whatever score would be a good score on the measure. And then it stops being a good measure of the target. It's no longer a good proxy. It's not a good representation anymore. And that's something that I think can happen with a lot of well-meaning attempts at devising metrics for evaluating people or having people do good at stuff. People focus too much. This happened to me as an undergrad. I focused way too much on ensuring I kept a good GPA rather than seeing college as an opportunity to learn and explore, and most importantly, challenge myself by taking courses that I might not get a good grade in. I didn't always do that, and I think that was an unfortunate decision. I guess keep that in mind. Sorry, I see a request, and maybe you had joined a little afterwards, but I'm not going to take any more requests because I'm going to have to be going in just a few minutes. Okay, let's look at what people are saying in chat. Looks like a lot of random stuff. People talking to each other. That's awesome. Any specific questions for me? Oh, thanks for the follow. And for anybody that gave me gifts, I was so focused at certain points, I didn't even have my eyes open, or I was like staring off into space. So I apologize if I didn't see your gifts, but I appreciate them all. Thank you very much. And again, thanks for the follow. Okay, any questions or comments for me specifically? I'll give you another couple minutes and then I will head out. I'll just wait and we will see. Oh, and I guess while I'm doing that, I'll say a couple other things. So over on my channel, Lance Independent on YouTube, so do go over there, check that out. One of my latest things, and I'd started to talk about this at the beginning of the live. So Sam Harris he's an author, philosopher, neuroscientist, all that stuff. Wrote this book back in 2011 called The Moral Landscape. I was very critical at the time. He talked to Alex O'Connor recently. You may know Alex as Cosmic Skeptic. And they talked about some issues in metaethics. And Alex, I think, is some type of anti-realist. I think he said he's a motivist, which is awesome because I'm a moral anti-realist too. And they had a discussion. And then shortly after, maybe it was a few weeks or whatever, maybe a month, or I don't know exactly how long, Sam Harris, maybe to revise and clarify his views, posted his latest episode on his Making Sense podcast. And there's a short, like 30-minute part of it on that's available on YouTube. Anyway, so someone on YouTube, Digital Gnosis, or Nathan, and I reviewed that 30-minute clip, and we criticized it. We criticized it quite harshly. And you could go check that out. What I'd really like to do is eventually, I'm a very small figure here. I have 1,000 something followers here on TikTok. I got 1,000 something subscribers on YouTube. But, it'd be great to talk to Sam Harris or Alex or somebody about these topics at some point. And maybe they just have other priorities than talking to some nameless person like me, and that's fine and that's understandable. But I'm going to keep getting out there, talking about these topics, talking about metaethics. But I do think that we raised some good criticisms, Nathan and I, of what Sam Harris says in that video. I do know that there's been previous criticisms too, and that some of those are quite good. So maybe we just don't have anything substantive to add to that. But I'm hoping if Harris never actually sees my criticisms, that he at least sees similar criticisms and can update and revise his views in response to that. But it's been over 10 years and it hasn't happened. So I don't know. Maybe someone could reach him. I do think he eventually had a more productive discussion with Dan Dennett. Someone says, what makes you think that we don't have free will? Well, it's going to depend on exactly what we're talking about when we talk about free will. So there's an earlier point in my video where I talk about that. What works on pragmatism would you recommend? So basically anything by William James. William James has some stuff that's especially available on Audible. And Schiller. So I really like Schiller's Logic for Use, but I don't know how accessible that is. That might be a really hard piece of writing to get a hold of. So I guess look up William James. I'm really into the classical pragmatists, specifically James and Schiller is relatively unknown. So just look up something, Pragmatism by William James, and you should be all set. Let me look up the specific thing that I had on Audible that I thought was really good. Because I think there's, in a few cases, a couple iterations of James. 1 second. One moment. So I have Pragmatism and the Meaning of Truth, which is a collected series of lectures that James gave, and that one I really like. And you could find that on Audible. There might be copies of it in other places. I like to listen to a lot of stuff on Audible. And this is specifically, maybe there's not another version, I don't know, but it's narrated by Adam Sims, and that one I really like. I did pick up another thing called Pragmatism by John Shook, but I haven't had a chance to listen to that yet. And I've also been working my way through Schiller's Logic for Use, but again, I don't know how accessible that is to people. There's also a really good video. It's like 7 or 8 minutes on the pragmatic conception of truth. Let me see if I can look that up real quick. I could recommend that because it's really cool. Try to see if it pops up right away. It does. So that's Philosophy Tunes, The Pragmatic Theory of Truth, William James, Pragmatism, Lecture 6. So if you check that out on YouTube, oh, that's just 2 minutes. That can't be the right video. What is the right video? I know there's a good video and it's a little longer than that, so it might not be that one. I'm going to have to save these so I can give them to people when they ask. Anyway, I am going to have to get going, so I'm not going to be able to address more questions. So I guess I will see you all next time. Take care.